What we are witnessing to nowadays is the combination of the aftershocks of the 2008 financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis in the years after, combined with the severe humanitarian crisis that has unfolded since the autumn 2015. What is important to remember in this context is that actually what happens is we see a redefinition of how the citizens and the states in which they are living in interact with one another. The populist radical right parties, they are using a certain way of communicating and dealing with particular issues, in this case the topic of the crisis, in such a way that we can see a combination of several factors. And what is of interest for me is exactly the intersectional perspective. So on the one hand we have the gender binary, so the dichotomy between the discussion about men and women and the redefinition of gender roles. At the same time, also the dyadic relationship between majorities and minorities. At the European level, we have a very wide variety of manifestations. So we have from, for instance, the transformations of the welfare state in Northern Europe to the challenges that the so-called younger democracies in Central and Eastern Europe are facing nowadays. At this moment, what we are seeing is that the European construct, as we know it, is facing some severe challenges. So we're not only talking about the crisis that the EU institutions are facing in terms of democratic deficit, but at the same time we can hear louder and louder voices in the right-wing populist quarters, not only against the European construct, but also for a redefinition of the relationship between, on the one hand, the member states and the European institutions, but also how the member states themselves are dealing with those citizens and non-citizens within the borders of specific member states. We have an intersection of several factors. So on the one hand, we have the rise in prominence of the so-called antigender ideology discourse that basically, in a way, is an attempt to return to a patriarchal understanding of the relationship between men and women, so a reinterpretation, a very conservative key of the relationship between men and women, combined at the same time with appeals to a popular sovereignty, and at the same time a very stark distinction, a Manichean distinction, I would say, between, on the one hand, the elites, which consider to be either the EU bureaucrats far, far away in Brussels, but also the mainstream political elites on the one hand, and on the other, we have the true people, the common citizens that the right-wing populist parties claim to represent. In the context of the new crisis, yes, of the 2015 humanitarian crisis, what we witness to is that we have an almost perfect overlapping between those appeals, identitarian appeals that separate the us and others, both in Western Europe but also in Eastern Europe, because surprisingly now people talk about the Muslim danger. The Muslim danger being obviously portrayed by the Syrian refugees that actually tried to escape for their lives from a war-torn country, but in the Central and Eastern European context being described as bearers of a possible cultural war and religious war. We are seeing more or less a combination of several axes of political radical right communication. And in here we see, on the one hand, what is important for the matter at hand is a definition of feminism as a gender ideology, in which we see, on the one hand, for instance, in the Nordic context, a definition of those women actively engaging in the state bureaucracy and actively participating in the transformation of the state towards a more gender equal society, being declared as femocrats and basically fighting against their own national interests. The ethnic minorities are also perceived with great suspicion because they are representing a threat. And in these terms, we are thinking of the demographic bomb. Yes, so if we can imagine, if we can connect to the various discourses, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, that connect the Romani minority with a, so to speak, tangible threat that at some point the minority might becoming a majority in the respective countries. Yes, so being very suspicious towards the Romani minority that it might overcome and become a majority throughout the whole region. And of course, connected to this in the context of the crisis, alleging to the unjustified economic costs for trying to integrate this minority in these societies. At the same time, what happens in the context of the humanitarian crisis is louder and louder criticism of the cost, so to speak, yes, in this context, of integrating the migrant communities. The success of these right-wing populist parties is very much contingent to how the other parties are reacting to the pressures that these are leveraging. So if we, for instance, we can think that in certain countries such as in Central and Eastern Europe, in which the right-wing conservative parties seem to have borrowed some of these issues into their own political platforms, which leads little by little to a normalization of these parties within the wider political discourse. Or we can see that, for instance, such as in Finland, where we have an attempt to give a deadly embrace to these parties. Yes? So inviting them into governmental position and hoping that in so doing they will prove to be completely inadequate for this task. However, it looks, the outlook is rather bleak, because in inviting these forces into the mainstream, what happens is that we witness to a normalization of not only symbolical violence, but also opening up the door for possible violent manifestations of extremism at the physical level, so not only at symbolical level.